You all know where the phrase rule of thumb came from? Back in the 13th century and early 14th century, so many women were being beaten to death by their husbands. In English common law, the rule arose that you could not beat your wife with a rod that was thicker than your finger. We have a lot of cultural baggage. Women were thought to be chattels, not fundamentally different than the table in your dining room. My wife, my woman, my possession. And it was still alive, and in some quarters it's still alive. The second thing we ran into was the culture that blames the victim. How many, if you get some of the providers here, ask them to tell you stories without telling you names. How many young women come to you and say, well, it was my fault. I didn't have the dinner ready. I shouldn't have done that. I should have had a bra on under my dress. I guess the skirt was too short. Maybe I shouldn't have been there. And the third one was credibility as to if she didn't report it, it mustn't have happened. Why not just report it? How many men do you know have said that? I wouldn't stay around in that circumstance. I'd leave. Well, it surprised me the resistance I originally got when we pointed these out. One of the few things I got extensive hate mail about was this legislation. Things you already knew about. And then I published a report. I gave great credence and widespread currency to report. In 1988, the Rhode Island Rape Crisis Center hired a legitimate pollster, and they polled 1,700 6th through 9th graders in the state of Rhode Island, their attitudes about a man forcing a woman to have intercourse against her will. 51% of those students said if the woman dresses seductively or walks alone at night, she is, quote, asking to be raped. 80% said it was okay for a man to force himself on his wife. I introduced, along with Birch Bayh, a neighboring senator, his father, Birch Bayh, the first law that said a man could be held accountable for raping his wife. And one senator who will remain nameless, as we passed it, he said, "You're young, Joe. You're young. You just don't understand. Sometimes a man just has to use force." There are cultural barriers that existed and some that still exist. And here's the one that I got the most. If we are asked, that got me the most in the survey, they were asked if it was okay for a man to force himself on a woman if he spent money on her on a date. 25% of the young boys, 6th through 9th grade, said yes. And a shocking 17% of the young women said yes. And Rhode Island is no different than Illinois or California or North Dakota or Texas or Florida or Delaware. So it became pretty apparent to me, and maybe it was known to everybody else, but it wasn't to me, that this problem was deeper than I ever thought. And we had to do something about it. Because of the brilliant staff I had, one of whom is now a federal judge, professors of constitutional law, these women who worked with me, I asked them to go on the road. And they literally went to almost every one of the 50 states to visit the centers and also research the laws in those states. To get the stories of women who ran the shelters, the rape crisis centers around the country, shelters that seemed to be supported by nothing more than bake sales and best intentions. That's what it used to be, bake sales. Not figuratively, literally. As we dove in further, we began to realize the unimaginable scope. I decided to ask for a report on all 50 states. I wanted to know what the laws were in those states. that obviously laid in a bias against women being able to be protected. And then the thing that really got people's attention was the report my staff put together portraying the human tragedy of a single, we entitled the report, "A Week in the Life of Violence Against Women in America." In that report, we just took reports of crimes that week that we published a report, detailing 21,000 crimes against women that were reported every single week in America. A small slice of the million-plus assaults, aggravated assaults, murders, rapes against women committed in the home and reported to the police that year. Just the ones reported. A woman whose boyfriend broke her arm by laying on his workbench with his hammer because she didn't have the meal ready. A woman whose father had beaten her in the head with a pipe. A 15-year-old girl stabbed by her ex-boyfriend on the day he was released from jail. The rapes, the beatings, the blood, the tears, all in 1 week and all before Wednesday. What became apparent to everyone who read that report is we had to break through those three cultural distortions. Blame the victim, this is a family affair, and why don't they just report it? The blame the victim issue was brought home in the early hearings by a model some of you may be old enough to remember named Marla Henson, whose face was slashed by an unrequited lover who wanted to go out with her and she wouldn't go out with him. She never did go out with him, ever. She told the committee when she came to testify about the letters, when I asked her, how did your friends respond? How did the women in your life respond? She put her head down and caught her breath, and she said, and she then started producing letters and recounting phone calls she got about the friends as well as strangers who she received when she was in the hospital recovering from an attack. She mentioned, and I quote, the unyielding element of blame, even anger, coming with comments like, well, what were you doing in a bar at 12 o'clock at night in the first place? Or quote, I told you something like this would happen if you moved to New York. And the list went on. This beautiful, wonderful young woman had her face slashed because the guy who ran her apartment, owned her apartment building, who asked her out repeatedly and she would not go out, asked her after work would he meet him at the restaurant bar in his building to discuss her rent. And she got blamed by so many people. Why did she go? What the devil does that have to do with the right of any man, any woman, anyone to slash another person's face? We're also up against those who thought violence in the home was simply a family affair. Look at the built-in biases in the statutes all around the country. I said my staff went out and issued this report. In my home state of Delaware, there was a law that I didn't even know existed. In Delaware, in 1994, you could not be convicted of first-degree rape if you knew your aggressor. So a woman who had gone out with a man before, or knew the man, and then went out with him and was raped, that man could not be convicted of first-degree rape. The implicit notion in it was she must have done something. She should have known. I promise you that law no longer exists in Delaware. In North Carolina, you couldn't be convicted of rape if you were living with your spouse. In California, police couldn't make arrests for violations of a protective order unless there was a witness. They witnessed the abuse. If it went on in the home, a woman had no recourse. I could list you chapter and verse almost every state in the union. All in all, in 1993, the Bureau of Justice Statistics again reported there were 1.1 million intimate partner crimes against women. And there is the psychiatric evidence that shows, as I said before, the women who experience wife rape, for example, suffer longer lasting physical and psychological injuries and as severe or more severe than those who are victims of stranger rape. Why? You question yourself. I should have known. Why didn't I see the signs? And on the third issue, why didn't you report this? You saw a lot of that in the Anita Hill thing.